They say a heart never breaks all at once. It breaks quietly, one empty chair at a time. On the 25th floor of a glass tower overlooking the snowy streets of Manhattan, Naomi Carter stood in the warm glow of thousands of Christmas lights, staring at the one setting that remained untouched. The crystal chandelier above her scattered golden reflections across the dining table, where two plates rested beside polished silverware and a bottle of wine Ethan Whitmore had promised to open with her exactly 5 years earlier when they bought the penthouse together. Outside, soft snow drifted through the winter sky, covering the city in a blanket of white, making every rooftop and every window sparkle with the kind of beauty people spend their whole lives chasing. Naomi had always loved Christmas because it was the one night Ethan forgot about board meetings, investors, and billion-dollar negotiations. At least, that was the man she had fallen in love with. She adjusted the sleeve of her dark emerald dress and glanced once more at the grandfather clock standing near the fireplace. 9:32. He was late. Again. But tonight felt different. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with gentle warmth, while cinnamon candles and fresh pine branches carried the scent of home through the air. Every decoration had been placed by her own hands. The stockings hanging over the marble fireplace, the handwritten card with Ethan's name tucked beside his plate, the small framed photograph of their first Christmas together when they had lived in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn and could barely afford a tree taller than 4 feet. Back then, they had laughed about sharing instant cocoa from paper cups because they believed love was enough to build a future. And somehow, they had been right. Naomi had watched Ethan become one of the youngest billionaires in New York. She had stayed beside him through endless nights of planning, impossible setbacks, and moments when the world doubted him. She never wanted credit. Seeing him smile had always been enough. Her phone remained silent on the table beside her. No message. No apology. She looked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Somewhere out there, families were gathering around fireplaces, children were opening presents, and couples were making promises they hoped would last forever. She wanted to believe Ethan was simply delayed by business, but a strange stillness had settled into her heart hours ago, the kind that arrives before a storm. She walked toward the Christmas tree, its tiny white lights reflecting in her deep brown eyes, and reached for a small velvet box hidden beneath the branches. Inside rested a simple platinum watch engraved with 4 words. "Thank you for choosing us." It was supposed to be her gift to him, a reminder that no amount of success could ever replace the family they had built together. Naomi smiled softly as she traced the engraving with her fingertips, but the smile faded when she noticed something lying near the entrance table. Ethan's second phone. He never forgot his phones. Never. The screen suddenly lit up, breaking the silence that had wrapped itself around the apartment. A single notification appeared against the dark display. Naomi did not move at first. She simply stared at it as the light flickered across the room like a distant star. Then another message arrived. And another. The final one stayed on the screen long enough for her to read 6 simple words that would change the rest of her life. "Tonight, you're finally all mine." Naomi stood perfectly still, the soft glow from the Christmas tree reflecting across the dark screen of Ethan's forgotten phone. The message remained there, almost innocent in its simplicity, yet heavy enough to silence the entire room. "Tonight, you are finally all mine." She did not reach for the phone immediately. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the dining table where 2 candles still burned beside untouched plates, their flames dancing gently as though they refused to believe the evening had already changed. A memory found its way into her heart without permission. 5 years ago, Ethan had held her hands on this very night and promised that no matter how large his company became, Christmas would always belong to them. He had smiled then, not like a billionaire, not like the face that appeared on magazine covers, but like the young man from Brooklyn who had once borrowed money to buy her a silver necklace from a tiny jewelry shop. Naomi finally picked up the phone. Her hands did not shake. Years of standing beside powerful people had taught her that dignity was often quieter than pain. She unlocked the screen with the same code Ethan had used since the day they married. For simple numbers. Their wedding anniversary. The messages continued to arrive. There were photographs of a luxury hotel decorated with towering Christmas trees and golden lights. A private dinner table rested beside a grand piano. Two glasses sparkled beneath a crystal chandelier. Ethan was not visible in any picture, but he did not need to be. The conversations told the story well enough. Vanessa Blake had spent weeks planning the evening. She spoke about the dress she had chosen, the music waiting for them, and the future she believed was finally beginning. Naomi read every word without anger. Strange as it seemed, the deepest wound was not betrayal itself. It was realizing that while she had been wrapping gifts and hanging stockings, someone else had been building memories with the man she loved. Her eyes wandered toward the small velvet box beneath the tree. She opened it again and looked at the watch she had chosen for Ethan months earlier. "Thank you for choosing us." The engraving suddenly felt like a message from another lifetime. The city outside remained beautiful. Snow continued to fall over Manhattan, covering sidewalks, rooftops, and busy avenues with peaceful white silence. Somewhere below, children laughed as they carried presents through the cold night. Somewhere, church bells rang softly across the river. Life had not stopped simply because one heart had cracked. Naomi closed the phone and placed it gently beside Ethan's untouched plate. She walked through the apartment one last time, touching the ornaments she had collected over the years. A glass angel from their honeymoon in Vermont. A wooden star they had painted together during their first Christmas as husband and wife. A tiny photograph tucked into the branches of the tree showing two young dreamers smiling at a future they believed they understood. She reached for her coat hanging by the entrance and slipped it over her emerald dress. Before leaving, she took a blank card from the table and wrote only a single sentence in careful handwriting. "I hope one day you find what you were willing to lose everything for." Naomi placed her wedding ring on top of the card, turned off the lights, and quietly closed the door behind her while the Christmas tree continued to shine inside the empty penthouse. The elevator doors closed behind Naomi with a whisper so soft it almost sounded like mercy. She stood alone as the numbers descended, watching her reflection in the polished steel walls. The emerald dress she had chosen for Christmas still looked perfect. Her hair still rested neatly against her shoulders. Nothing about her appearance revealed that the life she had built over 8 years had quietly slipped through her fingers in the span of a few messages. Outside the building, Manhattan welcomed her with cold air and falling snow. The city looked exactly as it always had on Christmas Eve, alive with lights, music, and strangers carrying gifts wrapped in silver and gold. A young couple hurried across the street laughing beneath one umbrella. A little girl pointed excitedly at the giant Christmas tree in the plaza across the avenue. Naomi realized the world had an incredible way of continuing, even when someone believed their own had stopped. She did not know where she was going. Her feet simply carried her through familiar streets until she reached a small church near Bryant Park. The old stone building had been there longer than most of the skyscrapers surrounding it. Warm light spilled through the stained glass windows, and the sound of a choir drifted into the snowy night. Naomi stepped inside. The quiet sanctuary smelled of pine branches and candle wax. Families sat together in wooden pews, children leaning against their parents while soft voices filled the room with old Christmas songs. Naomi slipped into the last row and lowered her eyes. She had not come to ask for answers. She had only come because she needed one place, where silence did not feel empty. She remembered another Christmas many years before, when Ethan had taken her hand after a service just like this one. He had looked at her and said that no matter how much money he earned, she would always be the greatest blessing God had given him. She had believed him completely. A tear finally escaped, rolling quietly down her cheek, but she brushed it away before anyone could notice. The service ended, and people slowly disappeared back into the night. Naomi remained seated until an elderly woman approached her with a gentle smile. Without asking questions, the woman simply placed a small white ornament into her hand. It was shaped like an angel with open wings. "Sometimes," the woman said softly, "the hardest thing a person can do is leave the place they once called home." Naomi looked at the ornament for a long moment before offering a grateful smile. When she stepped outside again, her phone rang. Ethan's name appeared across the screen. She stared at it until the call ended. A second call came only seconds later. Then a third. Finally, a message arrived. "Naomi, where are you? I came home. We need to talk." She looked up at the snow falling around her and remembered the card she had left on the dining table beside her wedding ring. For the first time in years, She understood that she did not owe anyone an explanation for protecting her own heart. She slipped the phone into her coat pocket without answering and walked toward the street where a yellow cab had just pulled to the curb. As the driver loaded her small overnight bag into the trunk, Naomi took one final look at the glowing skyline behind her. Somewhere inside that city was a beautiful penthouse filled with Christmas lights, expensive memories, and a man who had waited too long to come home. The cab carried Naomi through the sleeping city while snow gathered quietly along the edges of the streets. She sat beside the window with her hands folded in her lap, watching the familiar buildings disappear behind her one by one. The driver asked where she was headed, but she needed a moment before answering. There was only one place that came to mind: her grandmother's old cottage in Connecticut, a place nearly 90 miles from Manhattan where the world seemed slower and hearts had room to heal. The little house had been left to Naomi years earlier, though she had rarely visited after marrying Ethan. Life had become too busy. Board dinners, charity galas, endless flights, and the responsibilities that came with building a billionaire's empire had quietly replaced simple weekends beneath maple trees and quiet stars. As the city lights faded behind them, her phone continued to light up inside her coat pocket. Ethan called again. Then another message appeared. "Naomi, please answer me. I do not understand what is happening." She closed her eyes for a moment. The words almost made her smile. He did not understand because he had never imagined a day when she would choose herself over him. Back at the penthouse, Ethan Whitmore stood alone in the silence Naomi had left behind. The Christmas tree still sparkled near the windows. The fire had nearly burned out, leaving only soft embers behind. He loosened his tie and looked around the room, expecting her to walk out from another corner of the apartment with that gentle smile she always wore when he came home late. Instead, he saw the card resting on the dining table. Beside it lay the platinum watch she had chosen for him, and the wedding ring he had slipped onto her finger 8 years before. Ethan picked up the card with unsteady hands. "I hope one day you find what you were willing to lose everything for." He read the sentence once. Then again, his eyes moved to the empty chair across the table where Naomi should have been sitting. The untouched dinner. The candles burned almost completely away. The small details she had spent hours creating suddenly surrounded him like quiet witnesses. He opened the velvet box and found the watch. "Thank you for choosing us." The engraved words landed harder than any accusation ever could. Ethan reached for his forgotten second phone and unlocked it. His expression changed the moment he saw the messages from Vanessa Blake. The photographs, the conversations, the promises made so carelessly over the past months. He had told himself it was harmless, a distraction from the pressure of running a global company. He had believed he could control every part of his life the way he controlled business deals. But standing alone in the home Naomi had filled with warmth, he understood that some things did not wait for negotiations. His phone rang. Vanessa's name appeared across the screen. Ethan stared at it before pressing decline. She called again. He turned the phone face down on the table and looked toward the large windows overlooking Manhattan. Snow covered the city like a clean white blanket, but inside the penthouse nothing felt untouched anymore. Meanwhile, the cab finally reached the old cottage just before midnight. Naomi stepped outside into the quiet winter air. A single porch light still worked, casting a soft golden glow across the wooden steps. She unlocked the front door and walked inside. The house smelled of cedar and old books, exactly the way she remembered. On the fireplace mantel rested a faded photograph of her grandmother smiling beneath the same Christmas angel ornament Naomi now held in her hand. She placed the little white angel beside the picture and whispered the only word she could find. "I came home." Morning arrived quietly over the little cottage, and for the first time in many years Naomi Carter woke without the sound of emails, business calls, or the distant hum of Manhattan traffic. Pale winter sunlight slipped through the old curtains, painting soft lines across the wooden floor that her grandmother had polished by hand decades before. She stood by the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee, watching snow settle across the empty fields behind the house. The world felt slower here, almost as though time itself had decided to show her kindness. On the small table beside the fireplace rested the white angel ornament and the faded photograph of her grandmother. Naomi smiled gently at them before opening the old cedar chest that had not been touched in years. Inside were journals, family recipes, and sketches she had drawn long before she met Ethan Whitmore. Fashion designs, community projects, plans for a small foundation that would help women rebuild their lives after loss. She had once dreamed of creating something that belonged entirely to her, but somewhere between board meetings and luxury galas, she had quietly placed those dreams aside. In Manhattan, Ethan had not slept at all. The penthouse felt impossibly large with only one person inside. He wandered from room to room, noticing details he had somehow stopped seeing. The fresh flowers Naomi replaced every Friday. The family photographs she insisted on displaying instead of expensive artwork. The handwritten notes she often left beside his coffee cup before early meetings. He stopped in front of the Christmas tree and picked up the angel ornament box she had forgotten to pack. Empty. She had taken only that one small piece with her. His assistant called shortly after sunrise to remind him about a holiday charity event, but Ethan canceled it without explanation. For the first time in years, a billion-dollar schedule seemed meaningless. His eyes returned again and again to the empty chair across the dining table. Vanessa Blake called 3 times before noon. He did not answer. Finally, she sent a message asking if they would still meet after the holidays. Ethan stared at the screen before deleting the conversation entirely. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument he had ever known. Back at the cottage, Naomi carried a box of old clothes to the local church donation center, the same little stone church where her grandmother had volunteered every Christmas season. As she walked inside, she noticed a bulletin board covered with announcements for community projects. One flyer caught her attention. A local shelter for women and children had lost funding and would close before spring unless someone stepped in to help. Naomi stood there for several moments reading every line. Something deep inside her, something she thought had disappeared years ago, slowly began to wake. The pastor recognized her family name and smiled warmly. He told her that her grandmother used to say one simple thing whenever life became difficult. Broken branches still bloom when spring remembers them. Naomi looked out the church window at the snow-covered trees and realized she had spent too many years believing her story depended on someone else choosing her. Perhaps this quiet little town had not brought her here to hide. Perhaps it had brought her here to begin again. As the afternoon light faded across the fields, she returned to the cottage carrying a notebook she had found in the church office. She sat beside the fireplace, opened the first page, and wrote 4 words that would quietly change the course of her life. Build the life back. Winter slowly gave way to the first signs of spring, and with every passing week the little cottage seemed to breathe life back into Naomi Carter. The notebook beside her fireplace was no longer empty. Its pages had become filled with sketches, plans, budgets, and dreams she had once believed were too small to matter in a world that measured success by towers of glass and numbers on stock market screens. Every morning, she walked to the old church carrying a cup of coffee and a folder tucked beneath her arm. The shelter that had almost closed became her purpose. She spent hours repairing old rooms, organizing donations, and speaking with local business owners who were willing to help if someone simply believed the project could survive. She never told anyone about the life she had left behind in Manhattan. To the people in town, she was simply Naomi, the woman with kind eyes who stayed late to paint walls and write grant proposals after everyone else had gone home. The women who arrived at the shelter carried stories of disappointment, loss, and broken promises. Naomi listened more than she spoke. Somehow they trusted her, perhaps because they could see she understood that silence often carried the deepest scars. One afternoon, a young mother thanked her for creating a place where her little boy could finally sleep without fear of tomorrow. Naomi smiled gently, but when she returned to the empty office, she sat alone for a long moment, realizing that for the first time in many years, she had done something that belonged entirely to her own heart. Back in Manhattan, Ethan Whitmore found himself surrounded by success and completely abandoned by peace. Meetings continued. Investors called. Newspapers praised another business acquisition, yet every evening he returned to the same silent penthouse. The Christmas decorations had long been packed away, but he could not bring himself to move the empty chair at the dining table. Naomi's handwritten card remained exactly where she had left it. More than once he reached for the telephone to call her, only to discover that he no longer knew what words could possibly repair what his actions had broken. His younger sister Claire visited one afternoon and quietly walked through the apartment. She looked at the untouched watch Naomi had given him and then at her brother. "Do you know what she gave you that nobody else ever could?" she asked softly. Ethan looked down without answering. Claire picked up the little velvet box and placed it into his hands. "She gave you a home. The tragedy is that you only noticed after she left." Her words stayed with him long after she was gone. Weeks later, while reviewing paperwork for the Whitmore Foundation, Ethan discovered a forgotten file hidden among old project proposals. It was a presentation Naomi had prepared almost 3 years earlier. The title was simple: New Beginnings Initiative. It described a network of shelters and educational programs designed to help women rebuild their lives after personal hardship. Every page carried Naomi's notes and ideas. At the bottom of the final page, one sentence had been written by hand. "Kindness is the only investment that always returns more than it costs." Ethan closed the folder and stared out across the city skyline. He had spent years believing he was the architect of everything they built together, but page after page revealed a different truth. Naomi had never stood behind his empire. She had quietly been building one of her own, and he had been too distracted to see it. At that very moment, hundreds of miles away, Naomi hung a new wooden sign outside the renovated shelter. The afternoon sunlight touched the fresh white letters as children laughed in the yard behind her. She stepped back, looked at the building, and smiled. The sign carried only 2 words, but they felt like the beginning of an entirely new life. Second chance. Almost a year passed before Naomi Carter returned to Manhattan. The city greeted her with the same towering buildings and endless streams of yellow taxis, but everything felt different because she was no longer searching for a place inside someone else's world. She had built one of her own. The little shelter that began with peeling walls and uncertain donations had grown into a network of community programs across 3 states. Newspapers called it one of the most inspiring nonprofit movements of the year. Women who had once arrived carrying nothing but a suitcase now worked as teachers, designers, and business owners. They often told reporters that one woman had believed in them before they believed in themselves. Naomi never liked those interviews. She always said the same thing: people are stronger than they think. Sometimes they only need one door left open. That December, she received an invitation to the annual Winter Hope Gala in Manhattan, one of the largest charity events in the country. Her foundation had been selected to receive the Humanitarian Leadership Award. She almost declined. The city still carried memories she had worked hard to release. But the women at the shelter insisted she go. They bought her a midnight blue evening gown and tucked a small white angel ornament into her travel bag. One of the children handed it to her with a smile and whispered that every hero needed a little Christmas magic. Across town, Ethan Whitmore stood inside the ballroom of the Grand Lexington Hotel, surrounded by investors, politicians, and business leaders. He had attended the gala every year for nearly a decade, yet tonight the room felt strangely empty. Success had continued to follow him, but joy had quietly disappeared from his life. Claire stood beside him, studying the guest list in her hands. She suddenly stopped turning the pages. Her eyes lifted toward the entrance, and she looked at her brother with an expression he had never seen before. Ethan followed her gaze. The ballroom doors opened slowly, and Naomi stepped inside. The crystal chandeliers scattered soft light across her blue gown, while the silver snowflakes hanging from the ceiling seemed to glow around her. She wore no expensive diamonds. The only ornament she carried was the small white angel attached quietly to her evening purse. Conversations around the room softened as people recognized the woman whose story had inspired thousands. Ethan forgot the speech he had been preparing. He forgot the cameras, the reporters, and the executives waiting to greet him. All he could see was the woman he had once believed would always be waiting at home. Naomi noticed him almost immediately, but her expression remained calm. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness, only the quiet strength of someone who had survived a storm and discovered the sky afterward. She offered a polite nod before continuing toward the stage. Ethan watched as the host introduced her foundation and spoke about the lives she had changed. The audience rose to their feet in applause. Naomi stood beneath the golden lights and accepted the award with both hands. She looked across the crowded ballroom and spoke softly into the microphone. "The greatest gift life ever gave me was not success. It was learning that losing what breaks your heart can make room for what heals your soul." Ethan lowered his eyes as the room filled with applause once more, because for the first time he understood that the woman standing on that stage had not been destroyed by the night she walked away. She had been set free. The applause slowly faded, but Ethan Whitmore remained frozen in place. Around him, people continued talking about donations, partnerships, and the extraordinary woman who had transformed a forgotten shelter into a movement that was changing lives across the country. Yet all he could hear was Naomi's voice. The greatest gift life ever gave me was not success. It was learning that losing what breaks your heart can make room for what heals your soul. He had spent the last year believing that time would eventually dull the memory of that Christmas night. Instead, every passing month had only sharpened it. He remembered the untouched dinner table, the candles burned to nothing, the platinum watch resting beside her wedding ring, and the quiet sentence she had left behind. "I hope one day you find what you were willing to lose everything for." Ethan finally understood that she had never written those words to punish him. She had written them because she knew one day he would have to face himself. Naomi stepped away from the stage and was immediately surrounded by reporters and community leaders thanking her for the work she had done. She greeted each person with the same gentle smile she had always carried, the kind that made people feel seen instead of impressed. Claire looked at her brother and quietly placed a hand on his arm. "Go," she whispered. "Not because you deserve another chance. Go because she deserves to know that you finally understand." Ethan nodded slowly and walked across the ballroom. Every step felt heavier than the last. Naomi noticed him before he reached her, but she did not step back. She simply waited. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music from the orchestra drifted softly through the grand hall, while crystal lights shimmered overhead like falling stars. Ethan looked at the small white angel attached to her evening purse and recognized it immediately. It reminded him of the empty box he had found months ago beneath their Christmas tree. "You kept it," he said quietly. Naomi touched the little ornament with her fingertips and offered a small smile. "It reminds me that even after the hardest winters, people can still choose kindness." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I spent an entire year trying to understand how I could lose everything without even realizing it was happening." Naomi remained silent. He continued, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I thought success meant protecting what I built. I never realized that you were the one protecting me." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed the platinum watch she had given him. It had not left his side since the day he found it. "I should have opened this on Christmas night," he said. "Instead, I opened my eyes too late." Naomi looked at the watch, but made no move to take it. Around them, the crowd continued celebrating, completely unaware that two lives were quietly meeting again after a year of distance. Ethan took a slow breath. "I do not expect forgiveness. I do not expect you to come home. I only wanted to tell you that the man who stood in that empty penthouse finally understood what home actually was." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Then her eyes drifted toward the ballroom windows where soft snow had begun to fall over Manhattan once again. The same city, the same season, but neither of them were the people they had been 1 year before. Naomi looked at Ethan for a long moment, and in the quiet space between them, she realized that the anger she once carried had already disappeared. Time had done what arguments never could. It had revealed the truth. The man standing before her was no longer the confident billionaire who believed every problem could be solved with another conversation or another promise. He looked like someone who had finally understood the price of taking love for granted. Snow continued to fall beyond the ballroom windows, covering the city in soft white light. It reminded Naomi of the night she had left, walking away from the penthouse with nothing except her dignity and a small white angel ornament tucked into her coat pocket. She had believed she was losing everything. Instead, she had been making room for a life she had never imagined. Ethan held the platinum watch carefully in his hands. "I have replayed that Christmas night 1,000 times, he said quietly. "If I could trade every business deal, every award, every dollar I have ever earned just to sit at that dinner table with you again, I would do it without thinking." Naomi listened, but her heart remained calm. She reached out and gently closed his fingers around the watch. "Then keep it," she said softly. "Not because I want you to remember what you lost. Keep it because I want you to remember what love looks like when someone chooses you every day." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with the kind of sadness that only comes when the lesson arrives after the opportunity is gone. Is there truly nothing left for us? He asked. Naomi glanced toward the stage where volunteers from her foundation were laughing together. She saw the young mother who had found safety at the shelter, the little boy who now smiled without fear, and the women who had rebuilt their lives because someone believed they could. Then she looked back at Ethan. There will always be gratitude, she answered. You were part of my story. But some chapters are meant to end so that better ones can begin. A single tear slipped down Ethan's face before he looked away. Naomi reached into her evening purse and took out the small white angel ornament. She placed it gently into his hand beside the watch. My grandmother used to tell me that angels do not stop storms, she said with a gentle smile. They simply remind us that there is still light after them. The orchestra began playing a familiar Christmas melody as guests slowly returned to the ballroom floor. Naomi stepped back and offered him one final look, not with resentment, but with peace. Ethan watched her walk away through the crowd, her midnight blue gown moving beneath the golden lights like a quiet promise that hope always survives. She stopped for a moment at the entrance of the ballroom and looked out across the city skyline. The same towers stood beneath the winter sky. The same streets carried people toward their homes. But she was no longer the woman waiting beside an empty chair. She had become the woman who built tables where others could belong. Ethan remained where he was, holding the watch and the little angel, understanding at last that the greatest wealth he had ever known had never lived inside his company or his bank account. It had been waiting for him every Christmas night at home. Naomi stepped into the falling snow with a peaceful heart, and as the doors closed behind her, the city lights reflected across the white streets like stars scattered over a brand new beginning.